Tonight's guest is a philosopher firmly rooted in the humanist camp. He has written the foreword to Bork Nerdrum's latest book from an Aristotelian perspective, and he is soon to launch the new net-based magazine Civilization. His goal is to make painting great again. Carl Korsnes, welcome to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tonight we have quite a bit to cover. We'll be talking about Aristotle's Poetics,
Yes.
its importance to the Renaissance, and not the least its importance for Titian as a painter. How the Poetics was not seen as a dry text, but something that really could help you become a better storyteller. And something I was not aware of was the role of Plato also, who nearly toppled the whole idea of the Renaissance, but it was saved by Mr. Aristotle. But first, you, as I mentioned, wrote the foreword to Bork Nerdrum's latest book. You've entitled it Making Painting Great Again. I take it you find that painting is not great as it is now.
That's true. And by that, I mean that painting as a discipline is ruined.
Mm-hmm.
And of course not all paintings, but the majority of painting or a certain value system of painting. Mm-hmm. And that is what much of the introduction is about, is that there are two value systems that one can regard a painting to belong into one of them. And just to mention a brief story of how I came into Bork Nerdrum's Kitsch philosophy.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. It was my first class in aesthetics at the university, at West Chester University. We had a great professor in aesthetics. And during the first class, we were supposed to, actually during all classes, we were supposed to have 5 minutes at the end of each class, writing just what popped down into our heads. It could be something we have thought about during the week. It could be something we learned, some questions we had, or whatever. But during that first class, we were supposed to write, and we had learned nothing. I almost didn't know, because it was the first class, I almost didn't know what aesthetics was. How can you philosophize about art? So we were asked, what is art? Write down what you think it is. And there's no correct or wrong answer. You will not be graded on this. And I sat for a long time and I was like, well, art is... It was really hard. I used more than 5 minutes on writing nothing. And I started with the sentence, everything can be art. I have no idea where it came from, but that was what I wrote, because it has... That is what society teaches one in a way, because one has visited museums and you can see certain objects that are objects in use that suddenly is art. So it was like, okay, a young student, I have to make sure that all everything is covered.
Show that you're a philosopher.
Yes, right. And but then again, writing that, well, everything can be art, and then I started with some, but it has to be some intention behind it, or it has to be a meaning, or something like that. I don't remember, but I remember that first sentence. And there was something inside me that was like, this is not right, although I knew it was right.
Really?
Because it is right in a way if you ask the owner of a museum. So, but what I found to be wrong was that it's just bizarre to compare Rembrandt to a cigar. It sounds stupid, silly just to mention it, and that is what it is. So I was like, well, but an object like a cigar can be a work of art, but it is something that just didn't correspond. And then after going through a crisis, I read
Dark Night of the Soul.
Yeah. I read Bork Nerdrum's philosophy, and much made sense.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't say that there is something that is the proper thing to do, but that there are two value systems from which you can judge or view a painting, or a sculpture, or all these, or a piece of music, or a theater. And he has called it Kitsch, because many of those values that are looked down upon today, or according to the aesthetics of fine art, such as sentimentality or unoriginality and craft, were values back in ancient Greece.
Considered positive now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, for instance, sentimentality, if you are sentimental or pathetic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not positive.
That is not a
compliment.
It's not a compliment to a piece of art. What a pathetic painting. But back in ancient Greece, it was pathos. It was supposed to evoke strong emotions.
And if I may interject, apparently the etymology of it means physical suffering. You have that story of which sculptor was that? He made a woman who was about to die, and in the face he puts more silver into the metal so that she will be more pale.
Yeah.
And you sort of see the blood sort of going sinking. And that's to the sentimental or pathetic effect.
Yeah. And then comes as you said, the feelings or the emotions that are awakened are real or physical. It's not something that is like a polite sympathy towards something. It's like I really feel bad for those that are and some people that you do not relate to or anything, but you see in the news someone if their house is being destroyed by a hurricane. It's like, that is really sad. Yeah. It's like an objective statement, and it is sad, of course, it's terrible, but it's not the real emotion. Of course, some people are very emotional beings, but to most people watching the news, you get sort of a distance to it. But
so you're grading the degree of being gripped by it. I think José Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish sociologist, talks about, I might be misquoting him because it's some while ago I read what he wrote, but he talks about it almost in terms of rape. The work takes you, and of course this is as negative. But so you had an understanding of something was wrong with the comparison here, and
and I'm glad that you're taking me back on track, because I'm
that's my job.
Yeah. And so to use those three examples, sentimentality is regarded as a compliment back in ancient Greece. Nerdrum considers it a compliment, but today it's not, or in modern aesthetics or in fine art. And then you have, as considering it a craft, it's a virtue. According to the ancient Greece, you were supposed to use good craftsmanship was a good way of awaking emotions in the audience. You had to know how to make figures in paintings or sculpture that, for instance, were crying, because then you are awaking emotions in the audience. Then you had to know the physics of the body, and you had to know the craftsmanship of how to present that or to represent that in a painting or in a sculpture or whatever. But in the painting today, or in the modern painting, craft is not at least as important. In some cases it's not important at all, but it's not the main value. And what made sense to me when I was presented to this value system is that you can regard a painting from different perspectives. So to use an example, Sick Girl by Munch. Nerdrum has said it himself, but if you brought Aristotle back here, what would he say were the values of Sick Girl? It awakes strong emotions and pathos. It's very sentimental. It's very pathetic. It's a girl dying, and you see, and you are in the room with her the last moment, and it's very well crafted, and it's very unoriginal. It's death. It's one of the eternal subjects.
Yeah.
Love, death, and life. And just to finish my point, you can regard it from another perspective as well.
Yeah.
Use another value system.
Yeah.
To take the modernist art. You do not look at the craft very much. It's not very important. It's more that, well, it's original because it was not done at that time. And that's correct. One can say that it was not a very common kind of painting.
The technique, you mean?
Yeah. The technique at that time was not
the motif
very common.
was very normal.
Yes.
With the sick girl.
Yes. But that is the values that you extract from the painting from that other value system, and also so that it's original, that the craft doesn't matter very much, and you do not look at the sentimentality, for instance, but you look at other system. Is there a message there? Is there some kind of either political message, or is there something that represents that time, for instance? So, well, it can say something about society at that time, that a lot of young people died or something. So, and of course that
you see it as a cultural historical document. More or
either
less.
as a culture historical document, or as something that he was expressing his sorrow in a way. But the point is that they do not look as much at the product, the painting itself, but what is behind it.
But you also had, when you say that an expression of his suffering, that strikes me because this is one of the things I talked with Sebastian Salvo about, and also Boris Koller, how they do not talk about the sick girl as an expression of an archetype. They do not see the timeless situation in there, this loss of this human being. But I think this is a quite important point. The unconscious prejudices that you grow up with, that you are accustomed to. I remember thinking, I think this was in my teens, and where the hell did it come from? That emotions are abstract, so of course they can be best represented in an abstract painting. That was, and I hadn't read German philosophy at the time, but that was just something that what a friend of mine calls it, you learn by osmosis. You just live in that culture, and so you don't see the qualities that are actually there. But one thing that that strikes me is the necessity of being conscious about what you're doing, about reading things, on aesthetics, reading Aristotle, to know why you're actually doing what you're doing as a painter or a dramatist or whatever. And I guess that's one thing that you're talking about also in the foreword, how Odd Nerdrum saw these values as positive, what was denounced as kitsch, and then sort of traces it back to the Greco-Roman ideas, or Greek, basically, Greek ideas and Greek virtues, and then has become increasingly concerned with Aristotle in the later years. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the point that you mentioned is, to me, you're asking what is the importance of philosophy.
Yeah.
And I would say that as I have mentioned before, the ignorant man would say something, a sentence starting with the word just. So in the case of painting, it would be just paint.
Right.
Or it would be in dancing, just dance.
Yeah.
Or just write. Or if you take it further, to make it more bizarre, you could say, tell a president, just rule.
Yeah.
Just do something.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's appropriate, or it can be fitting to say just. For instance, in today's Western society, the tradition of dancing is almost dead. The traditional dances, they are kept alive in small communities, but compared to just like 200 years ago or something, it's almost non-existing. So when the youth are having a fun time today and dancing, and they are dancing, they're not dancing as they have learned in a way. They're just moving their bodies. And in that case, it is not important how you move your body or how you dance, and then you can say, just dance, because you really don't care. But then again, you wouldn't say that to a president or to a prime minister, just rule, or to someone that has an important thing to do. So to me, philosophy is something, or to philosophize about something is something you do about something that you care about.
Right.
So if you really do care about dancing, you can philosophize about it. What is it about moving your bodies together? What is that makes it a pleasurable experience? And that was what Aristotle did with poetry.
When we're drifting then directly into what he writes in the Poetics, and I wanted to do that through Thomas Putfarkin's book Titian and Tragic Painting, and it strikes me when I read that book, if you're talking about the contemporary time of Titian, especially in the first half of the 16th century, there's very little writing about painting. And it is some decades where Plato is quite dominant. And then you get the translation of the Poetics coming in, I think it was translated as early as the 30s perhaps, but it gets increasing influence in the 1540s and onwards. And he brings in a respect for imitation of mimesis and being able to conjure up an image that is vivid, that is lifelike.
Yeah.
And he talks about, and I think this has been so fundamentally important to the Renaissance that if you did not have Aristotle, Plato might very well have toppled the whole thing. And an important thing for Aristotle then is the need to create tragedies, to craft tragedies. So perhaps we could first talk about what is a tragedy and why is it important for a human being to engage in that, read a tragedy, look at a painting which is a tragedy.
Yeah. Just one thing that came into my mind when we talk about Plato and Aristotle taking over after Plato was that when Plato was before the Renaissance had started, what people were interested in, or what the main discussion within painting was that should it be fictional or should it be historical?
Right.
Because, and there you get the moral perspective. Should it be something true or should it be something that is not true that you have made up yourself? And I guess some painters, some philosophers were very engaged in it, that it should never be something you made up yourself, or vice versa. Then Aristotle comes and said, it's not of any importance. Like, who cares? Couldn't care less.
It's about the quality.
Yeah.
So that's what he brings in, because this is one thing that Poetics is talking about, how the need to justify what we today call classical figurative painting, representational painting. You need to justify it through referring to some kind of morale. Mm-hmm. It's not enough that it's well crafted and convincing. And that's one thing that the influence of Plato led to, that humanists would argue for the importance of imitation by saying that this is an imitation of the idea of a human being.
Yeah.
So they make it into something for a higher goal, which is not about your experience of it, or how it affects you. And then I guess, Aristotle releases that pressure.
Yeah. We humans are very strange creatures. There are so many irrational aspects of our behavior. And one of them is watching tragedy and enjoying it. And here comes yet another difference between Plato and Aristotle. Plato sees this and thinks this is just irrational, to have an enjoyable experience from seeing, or to enjoy the pity and terror that you feel when watching a tragedy. It's irrational. And therefore, I am denying it.
Well, also for strictly political reasons.
Yeah.
In his case.
Yes, in his case it's political, but it seems that it was more personal as well. That he actually found this irrationality in a way disgusting, or something that it was like not, it was uninviting. What Aristotle does is that I think he also sees this, that it's irrational. But he takes that as well, that's how it is. And instead of denying it, he tries to explain it. And so he said, well, we enjoy having this reaction of pity and terror. How is this so? Like, why is this the case? And he comes up with the explanation of catharsis,
Right.
which is the end point of watching tragedy or something tragic. And catharsis is always translating those Greek terms, but it's some kind of release or cleansing in a way of emotions. But then there are different explanations to what catharsis is.
Yeah, and I think what Malcolm Heath does in this edition, he talks about it, mentioning that the Poetics is not a complete book, but that catharsis is not about ending these emotions, stopping them, but about changing it and making it so that you do not feel them excessively in the wrong time towards the wrong things or whatever.
Yeah.
So what we are talking about here is then that there's a certain function of not of a didactic statement, but that watching a tragedy is somehow something you can learn from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like if you contrast two versions of it, just to illustrate that it's not about propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
I heard about this North Korean opera, which was about a North Korean flower girl who's raped by an American soldier. So you know who is the good guy and who is the bad guy, right? It's almost to the point where his worst atrocity is not the rape, but the fact that he's American. Mm-hmm. And then you have Ilya Repin's Ivan the Terrible killing his son. And then you have the specific moment where he understands that he has killed his own son and it can never be made good again. Mm. And when you see such a painting, that can lead you to an experience where you think, well, I have to be careful not to experience those sleepless nights that awaits Ivan in that situation. And then perhaps you can think about, well, how do I treat other people around me?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one theory that you mentioned is that, as I have understood it, you watch a tragedy, you see Oedipus on stage having his the destiny has been fulfilled. He ended up killing his father and marrying his mother, and he's ripping out his eyes. Mm. And you're enjoying watching that, feeling that pity, because that you recognize his sorrow and despair, and you feel terror because you think that could be me, because he is a good character. And people often regard themselves as good.
Yeah.
And so that theory is that by being presented to those or experiencing those extreme emotions, because that's not what happened to a common man, that you end up killing your father and marrying your mother. It's not common.
No, it's
and so being exposed to those experiences and feelings, because they are, according to Aristotle, they are real. It's not something you watch on the news. They are real because you experience them. That releases some of the, in a way, as I read that theory, some of the tensions that you have for that pity. If you have some terror in your heart, carrying that with you, and you watch that, you get it so strongly that when it's done, you feel better.
Yeah, it's like if you've been crying, you feel much better afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. That's not the case with me. But my girlfriend, she's like, after crying, it feels so good, and I'm like, it just feels terrible.
Okay, we'll do that in a separate interview.
But I do enjoy watching tragedies. Yes. When living a relatively comfortable life in a society, you need sometimes to be confronted with other aspects of life. And for instance, there is some words of wisdom from the Oglala Sioux tribe that says that truth can come with two faces: the sad face that cries, or the happy face that laughs. But it's the same truth.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you need to hear the truth from the sad face. When you're when you are very like, you know, high on yourself and very like, I can do anything and there's no worries in the world, like, don't worry, be happy, everything like that. Sometimes you need to then hear the sad aspects of life. And if you are very sad and very downtrodden in a way, you need to hear the truth from the happy face, laughing. And that could be another aspect of the values of watching a tragedy. And that actually resonates much with Aristotle, who talks about the golden mean, finding the mean of everything. That when you become too, I shouldn't say comfortable, but too...
well, it's what you call the comfort zone.
Yes. It's healthy to sometimes be dragged out of that comfort zone.
So it reminds you of a sort of state of nature.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and this is, I think, a fundamental issue. And Aristotle does talk about this distinction that you mentioned between poetry and history. And saying that history is about things that are sort of photorealistic, so to speak. You know, true, more or less. Poetry is more serious and more philosophical because it deals with universals.
Yeah,
I think that is what you're talking about there. That let's say, okay, you have the idea of catharsis where you need to sort of correct yourself, like an electric shock or so.
Yeah.
But there's also the thing of just a reminder of how existence actually is. And wouldn't that be a fair thing to say? I guess, you know, you have this expression, how is it? Intelligent people learn from other people's mistakes. Only the stupid one can only learn from his own mistakes. Right. I think this is also what Roger Scruton and Jordan Peterson is talking about in a conversation on the transcendent. How you can experience, well, you can learn from seeing other people's behavior in a book, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, it's universals are definitely important to Aristotle, and I regard that as an answer to Plato. Yeah. Because Plato was his teacher, and Plato denounced poetry. And one of the reasons, we're actually going through the list here that I'm having in my head. So one of them is that it's that this reaction to enjoying the emotions of pity and fear is irrational. Another point, which is maybe even stronger, is that it's not true.
Right.
It doesn't express truth.
Right.
So one of the reasons why Plato denounced poetry is that poetry is a kind of representation of reality. It's a mimesis.
Yeah.
So it doesn't express truth. It's actually 2 steps away from truth, because according to Plato's theory, you have the ideal world, And then you have the physical world, the sensible world, which is just as a shadow of the ideal world. So you have the ideal horse, and then
whore or horse?
Horse or whore, for that matter, and then you have the sensible horse, which is never exactly like the ideal.
Right.
It's just like a shadow. But if you then paint the physical horse, it's a copy of or it's a representation of the truth. So it's one further step away from truth, and it should therefore be denounced.
Right. So that's the moral issue he has with representation.
Yes, and that's how I consider Aristotle's mention of the universal. He says that you can learn something from representations or from poetry or from painting, and that is that it expresses or that it represents something universal that says something about human nature.
I remember going to it was Rotterdam. They had this painting by Rembrandt. I went there with Nerdrum and some other students. But when we came there, it was not there anymore. And Nerdrum said that the last time he was there, it was taken to a not so nice placement because Rembrandt Research Project had been there and said it was not Rembrandt. And when we came there, it was not there. There were no cards of it in the store, so it was just gone. And that's when I said afterwards, well, this proves that somehow ironically that Kant was right. People do not see the thing in itself, because when the signature was not there, it was not a good painting anymore.
Yeah.
So people are unable to understand that the actual reality is physical in front of you.
Yeah.
They think it is something abstract, and this is the Platonic idea that you're describing.
Yeah, and that's something that is very, very much considered a value today, and that is who has created it, who is the painter, and
not what is painted, how good is it, but who. Right.
Yeah, I have one story that keeps amazing me every day, and the reason why it amazes me every day is because I'm reminded of it every day, because it is a painting that hangs on my wall. There is a website where you can sell whatever, like Craigslist, the Norwegian Craigslist, and I saw a painting for sale, and I was like, wow, that is an amazing painting. And it didn't say any price, so I called the person and said, hi, I would like to buy the painting. Can I come and have a look at it? And I went over there, and he was actually an art dealer, but he was closing down his shop.
All right.
So he was selling away all the paintings. And it's this amazing painting. It's like 1 x 120 meters. And it's so skillfully painted that I was just amazed. I expected it to be a small painting, maybe a copy as in a photocopy or something. It's such an amazing painting. One of the better ones I've seen the best one I've seen for sale at any time. And I was thinking, I must have this painting. It looked like it could belong in a museum or in a millionaire's collection. And I was asking, how much is the painting? And the amount was so low that it was even affordable to a poor student. I was a student at that time. And it was less than half of like a monthly salary or something. And the reason why I didn't ask him why is it so cheap, but I was asking why are you selling it? Why are you not selling it through your art dealing shop or something? And he said, well, it's unsigned.
Right.
and he didn't know anything about the painting. He didn't know when it was from. He said it's definitely before the 1900s, but it's unsigned and it's yeah. And I ended up buying it, and I found out that it was made by a Dutch painter from the 1550s, Marinus van der Rijmersweile.
Right.
And it's a classical piece that was made at his art shop from the 1550s. If he had known who had created it, I could not afford it. Right. You could not afford it. We could not afford that painting. Maybe not even the National Museum could afford it. Yeah. But because he didn't know who created it, he was so removed from reality. He only saw the metaphysical aspects of the painting, or he didn't see the metaphysical aspects of the painting.
So what we're talking about here, one of the overarching themes of this conversation is the potential catastrophic consequences of choosing the wrong philosophical principles as a guide for a culture. Because if you choose principles that do not look at, in this case, the quality of the actual painting, then you take away the possibility of these paintings to survive. For example, Georges Latour, this French painter, for a long time he was quite unknown. So now they think perhaps a third of his production is just destroyed because nobody took care of it, because he didn't have a name. The opposite of that would be the way they were thinking in the Renaissance. There's some really funny stories about Michelangelo making copies of then already old master drawings, faking them, making them look old, and he would return the copy and keep the original. And they couldn't tell the difference. And of course that's an amazing feat. And then you can think, well, if you have values that are built on a respect for mimesis, for imitation, for skill, what if, that's my wet dream when it comes to collector. Let's say you have a painter who makes an exact copy of, it could be a Leonardo or whatever, and really of the same quality. And then the collector thinks, well, that is newly made. That will probably last longer. I think I'll have the copy. You can keep the Leonardo. That's virtue, because then you are able to judge the skill of the quality of the actual work. And when it comes to Aristotle, I think it cannot be underlined enough the immense importance that he had for creating a respect for creation of images. And this so-called increasing freedom of the painters in the Renaissance that people talk about has to do with at least two things that are not often mentioned. It has to do with Aristotle creating a respect for mimesis, an admiration for the ability to imitate, and his defense, I guess you could say, well, at least in the face of Plato's influence, of the narrative. And it shows you, I mean, the Renaissance is the perfect example of how important basic philosophical principles are for the survival of what is created in the culture.
Yeah, and that comes back to some of the values that I mentioned in the beginning, as do you consider it a craft?
Yeah.
Or is the craft not as important? Because if you consider it a craft, the product alone is the importance.
Right.
You don't ask, in general, when you see a house, oh, who was the carpenter of this house? Or,
oh, it's Olsen. Well, it's not a good house then.
Yeah. Of course, you can ask it if you see several houses that are made by the same carpenter.
Well, you would ask because you're impressed by it.
Yes, exactly.
You want the same carpenter.
But not having like a stone face and then saying, who created who built this house? Oh, it was this guy. Oh, it's fantastic! It's fantastic. I have to buy this house just because this carpenter made it. So just to put it on the extreme here. But the point is that if it's considered a craft, the product alone is of importance.
Right.
And I remember when I became aware of the consequences regarding something as a craft or not. That was, I was taking the test. You know about the test. Are you a kitsch? The test. Are you a kitsch person or an artist? It's the test on worldwidekitsch.com. And I remember one of the questions was something like, as you know, that if you're a kitsch person, that is Aristotle. If you're an artist, that is Immanuel Kant. And they tend to have different answers to the same question.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah. So one of the questions were, who is the best, who is most qualified to judge a sculpture? Is it a sculptor or an independent critic? And to me, when I read that, I was like, of course it's the sculptor. And I had never thought about it before, because it's so common today that it has to be an independent and objective critic. And I became a bit ashamed of myself being a philosopher, talking about paintings and sculptures.
That's new. I haven't heard that one before.
Probably you will never hear it again. No. And so what I realized is that I'm sitting here as a philosopher talking about painting, and I hardly knew how to use a brush.
Right.
And I decided I had to learn more about painting, at least the basics of it. And it has it has been such a great experience learning how to think while painting. It's such a different way of thinking, and it definitely has affected how to philosophize about painting at all, because
because you think with your eyes.
Yeah, and it becomes something that is not removed from reality in a way, that it is based on a certain kind of inspiration or some kind of gift that you have, but it is hard fucking work that is required to make a masterpiece or a good painting.
Yeah.
And
that's where you have Mr. Aristotle, right?
Yeah.
That what strikes me about the modern way of thinking is that instead of concrete, objective ideas, you get abstract ones, where you're not certain about what you shall say. You have to think about with your social antennas instead of your integrated knowledge. Yeah. And there's two examples. That amazed me, reading about Ilya Repin, how in Tsar Russia, if you were in the military, and of course, you know, all the Russian novels are about some girl wanting to marry some military man. Well, not all the Russians, but hashtag not all Russians, but there's some Englishmen too. Anyway, climbing in the hierarchy of the military, you had to be noble, of noble descent, family. But in painting, that was not a rule. So Ilya Repin, because there were objective criteria to if something appeared to be living, then he could become the greatest painter of Russia. Because you can see that this is not just red paint, it's a red cloak. This is not just some fleshy color, it's flesh. Because the virtue is about transforming paint into a cloud or into skin or something like that. So there were certain objective criteria, and that's what I've been saying also to my students, that what I teach is not my style or Nerdrum's style or Rembrandt's style. You can see the same basic things in Chinese silk painting from the 18th century, or in Munch, or in Rembrandt, or whatever, when it comes to creating a three-dimensional form.
Yeah.
And that's the objective standard. Then you get, I think this is a question of being conscious. Then you get the other side, which is, I remember talking to a figurative sculptor, and he was reading a book on de Kooning, the abstract expressionist.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we were talking about also Thomas Kincaid, who made this Deer by the Pond and all these things, you know. And of course, of very low stature socially, because he was filthy rich, as they say. And I said to him, well, why are you reading a biography on de Kooning and you're laughing at Kincaid? Because you know that you're much closer to Kincaid than to de Kooning. Yeah. Because there are certain criteria, you know, after all, about spatial depth and these things. And he didn't understand this at all, because he was thinking with his social antennas through abstract values instead of concrete, physical, objective values about what is a good painting, what is not a good painting. And of course that has to do with creating three-dimensional form. Yeah. But so when we're then talking about tragedy being somehow, you know, a depiction of universals, you have Plato, who says that, well, this is just a temporaneous copy, so to speak. On the other hand, you have what Jordan Peterson has mentioned, that when he talks about Dostoevsky, it is even more true, because it's a condensed version of reality. And then you're back to expressions of universality, not just a naturalistic description, but something which is eternally valid. And I guess that also plays into the hand of this thing about Plato, who on the other hand could accept mimesis if it was a strict copy. Do not add anything, do not give it pathos or sentimentality, just a strict copy. This is what he calls simulacra. Yeah. And what he denounces is the phantasma, where you start creating this drama, these great stories, right? Yeah. That really grips you.
It's always so useful to think, what is the opposite?
Yeah.
What is the opposite of the universal? If it sounds like, oh, it's so mystical, the universal or something. But what is the opposite? The opposite is the particular and subjective. The purely subjective. And how do that function as communication?
Right, because it doesn't pertain to anyone else but you.
Yeah, I often think of the opposite of the archetypes or of the universal as gossip. Gossip,
right?
That's particular and subjective. Yeah. You know what John did to Mary?
Yeah.
It's particular about John, it's particular about Mary. Right. And it's a way of degenerating a story instead of elevating it. So without knowing it, the gossip, and often it is, can be a universal story, but you're making it particular.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about, oh, it's so important what he did and what she did and how he answered and what she answered and what I think about it because I think that he's an idiot or something. Yeah. But often it's a universal story about love or unfaithfulness or something like that.
So this is tunnel vision.
Yes. So instead of seeing that universal aspect of it and actually making it something that you can tell, a story you can tell your grandchildren, you're making it something that you can tell your neighbor right now. Do you know what? You know? And so that's like an easy way to see what is useful with the universal and how approachable it can be.
So this is why Aristotle says that poetry is more serious and more philosophical than history writing.
Yeah,
which of course is on a higher level than what you're describing now, but still. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not more. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
Right.
That you actually try to see the essence of things, and to see the essence of things can be you have a story and you parenthesize some things, some aspects of it. The philosopher Husserl, he talks about parenthesizing aspects in order to find the eidos, the essence of something.
You mentioned the things that are too personal. Mm-hmm. This is kind of the beef I have with, for example, Frida Kahlo, the Mexican painter.
Yeah.
What she does is very much based on the need to know her biography about this accident and the Mexican muralist she was married to and their affair or whatever it was. And that is something that makes it too confined to specifics, so that when you come to another time where you don't know these prejudices, it doesn't pay off to adhere to those prejudices. Then the work doesn't stand on its own. Right. So to be specific about what tragedy actually is, what does Aristotle says when it comes to the technical definition? What is a tragedy? What is it an imitation of? Can you lay out the case for that?
Just to mention one more, because that is more directly related to tragedy and Titian, which I think was so interesting when I read Putfarkin's amazing book.
It's excellent, yeah.
It's excellent. He mentions, or he gives you certain directions on how to create something that has the effect on the audience that you want, and that is of pity and horror.
Yeah.
So, and what is so interesting is that if you use the Poetics as a point of departure, you can theorize so much about it. Not only theorize, you can experiment. What creates the best emotion? And that is where Titian was fantastic. I read somewhere in that book that he had a friend who was an architect who helped him design the background or to draw the background of the building to make it most emotional, to awake most fear among the audience. Right. And one of it was that the bricks were supposed to be large and rough.
Right.
They were not supposed to be smooth marble. That is amazing that you can use the architecture in the background to make the most dramatic effect, and it's supposed to be dark and it's supposed to be everything. And so, although it is not mentioned in Aristotle that you're supposed to make the bricks rough, but that is how you can use it.
So it's a way of thinking that unfolds naturally.
Yes.
And so this reminds me of what Jan-Ove Nerdrum and myself were talking about in front of Caravaggio in the documentary on Nerdrum. How everything, and this is, and I know Putfarkin had started a manuscript on Caravaggio, I think in relation to Aristotle. So what Caravaggio does is specifically Aristotelian in that all the things that are in the painting, all the effects are there to underline the story. When you have the raising of the cross, he's being crucified upside down and the raising of the cross, you see that they've pushed aside a stone, and you see the depression of this from the stone in the ground. And they've been busy moving around, getting this cross up that they're pushing.
Yeah.
See? So that little thing there is there because it creates more drama. There's been movement. There's been something that has gone before, and this is going on now, and then you have the thing that is going to happen.
And I've been asking myself, what is the first step? Not the only step, but what is the first step in order to revitalize the Kitsch value system, or the Greco-Roman value system, that values craftsmanship, sentimentality, pathos, and unoriginality, among others, and story.
Or doesn't see originality as a point.
Exactly, yeah. And which of these should be first from a strategic point of view? I think the craftsmanship is the first step on the way. I'm not sure about it, if you have any thoughts about it, but I would be happy to hear that. But in the beginning, when the fine art was developed, craftsmanship lost its value or became secondary. It didn't lose.
Century, they start talking about art or craft.
Yeah.
Art versus craft.
Yeah.
Right.
And it didn't. It's a complicated relationship between those, because when it's art, is it still craft and everything? But at least the craftsmanship became secondary. And as a final consequence, it can lose its importance altogether. And I think it easily becomes a vicious circle. Because when people know, when it's no longer required for art to be skillfully crafted, then that is not the basis of what it's judged on. And then the viewers don't have to know anything about the craft. And then the craftsmen or the artists don't have to know much about the craft, and then the appreciation disappear in a way from the audience as well.
Yeah, because they don't know what to look for.
Yeah.
Well, this is what you discovered learning how to paint.
Exactly.
Right.
When learning how to paint at least the basics, I knew how much hard work that goes into a good painting.
You can no longer afford to be what they call patronizing, because when you know too much about it, you have to take into account that creating a bad portrait at least is quite difficult, because there are certain things you have to know in order for it to be a portrait. Right?
Yeah.
So then you get into. But I wanted to challenge you a bit on this thing about, okay, what is craft the most important? Because what I see, there is a certain trap in that, in the following sense, that a lot of painters, I think, can focus only on that, and because they shall make real art, not this fake modern art, but real art, and so they only focus on that. And getting the proportions in order, color is correct, but they forget storytelling. And I think, and this is something that the art sociologist Dag Solhjell has mentioned, that the basic thing here, and this is partly me too, the basic thing is not abstraction versus figurative painting, but as Solhjell mentioned, it's storytelling. Because there's a lot of figurative art today, completely expressionless faces, no action going on. So I think the idea of telling a story is a really grand driving force, and that is what Aristotle defends and makes a case for, and that's what created the peak of the Renaissance. So I think you could say that, of course, this is meaningless if you don't have it paired with craft.
Oh yeah.
But the consciousness of Aristotle, reading Aristotle, I think would really help when it comes to creating a new Renaissance, as is normally talked about.
Yeah, I think I definitely see your point, and I'm just thinking from a more, not necessarily what is most important, because I think that's very hard to say what is important, most important. But Plato meant that poetry was a kind of an inspiration that did not use reason. And that is somewhat the situation that we see today, that the artist is regarded as someone that has a inspiration. And if you ask that person, the artist, how did you make this painting? If it is a modernist abstract painting or something, you seldom receive a very explanatory answer. That reminds me of the friends of Franz Schubert. Schubert, he wrote...
The composer?
Yes, the composer, my favorite. He wrote, together with Tchaikovsky, he wrote so many pieces in such a short time, because he died at the age of 30-something. And it was said that he could write large pieces down the sheets. He wrote the notes down without making any corrections. And that is very uncommon.
Yeah.
So there were, and he had a group of friends, and they were divided into two groups. One of them, like one of the group of friends, were saying that he had a divine gift. He must have had direct contact with God. Because it is impossible to write that many pieces that are really extraordinary. They are not simple pieces. They are classic after classic after classic. He wrote so many fantastic pieces, so he must have had direct contact with God. The other group of friends were saying, no, we know how much he has worked for this and how much he has suffered for this. And that's two different answers. One of them is the Platonic, saying that he had a certain inspiration that does not relate to rationality, while the others say, the Aristotelian response, this is a skill that follow rational rules.
My view is that throughout history, if we start today, as far as I see it, you have the two value systems, art and kitsch. And they are basically new versions of the old Plato-Aristotle dichotomy.
Oh yeah.
There are so many, almost to the detail, similarities between Plato and Immanuel Kant, who of course was decisive for the fine art system. I mean, you have, Plato has the idea of the possessed poet. Kant has the idea of the inspired genius. And Kant, of course, also says directly that imitation is in direct opposition to genius. And you are first creating art when you do not know what you're doing. And both have, in Kant specifically, but both have a concept of aesthetical indifference, not being gripped by what you see. Plato has this idea of simulacra. You just make an exact copy. It's still a mimesis, but it's less bad than if you create a dramatic story. And of course Kant has the aesthetical indifference where he says plainly that if you are gripped by the work, emotionally gripped by it, really like in the Aristotelian sense basically, then this is barbaric. And to judge a work as a good work because of that is just completely brain dead, you know. And both of them have an idea of the bureaucrat deciding what is good or not. And by that I mean the philosopher working for the state shall sit and judge if this is good or not, because of course the genius doesn't know what he himself has done. Mm. If Kant is Plato, who is Aristotle today?
It's difficult to find one Aristotle today, I would say. Within much of his philosophy, I would say that Ayn Rand is the closest one.
Right.
But not so much in aesthetics.
No, I agree. Yeah.
She has the points of rationality and about being empirical, having an empirical viewpoint, but she was maybe too influenced by her time and cultural preferences when it came to aesthetics. And to see, I think it's useful to compare how Plato was the point of departure when Aristotle was rediscovered.
Yeah.
So we have been through, I think, almost all of these points, but just to have them listed up, some of them. And one of them is that the creator, to use that word,
well, that's what poet means.
Yes, does not use reason, but has a certain or uncertain inspiration.
That's Plato, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. This is Plato, the point of departure before Aristotle was rediscovered.
Right.
The poet or the painter had a certain kind of inspiration. And also the representation or mimesis was not looked upon as something positive. It was something negative because it was untruthful. So therefore you have discussions such as, should it be fictional or should it be historical? And then one last point is that poetry or tragedy awakes these wrong emotions that are scorned upon by Plato. They're not rational, they're not right. And as we have talked about with tragedy, that you actually enjoy having the feeling of pity and terror. And just think about it, how irrational it is. Listening to a Schubert sonata, starting to cry. They are just tones that are played on a piano. Or watching a sunrise. They're just electromagnetic waves. It's irrational to have a strong emotional reaction to it. And this was the basis point of Plato, from Plato to which Aristotle responded. And he responded to the first point that this was inspiration, not using reason. No, it's a skill where you use rational rules to create a story.
Yeah.
And it's not a further removal away from truth because it is a representation of something, a copy of something and not being real. He removes that metaphysical bullshit and says, no, this is a representation of something universal. It teaches you something about the human experience. It has a certain value. And then as the third point, that as a response to that these are irrational emotions, to get feelings out of a piano piece or a sunrise. Yes, says Aristotle, but it's still the case. So he is not a denier of reality and saying that, well, this is not how it should be. He says it is how it is, and it is called catharsis.
Right. And then you're into something here, because it strikes me that Plato is not very... It seems that he's not very knowledgeable about human psyche. Campbell talks about this, how he's invited to talk about myths and schizophrenia. You find it on Spotify, his lectures. You can hear it there. And I am not no expert on schizophrenia, but this is just a recount of what he's saying. So apparently there are certain sort of rituals or transitional experiences that are necessary for a human being. And if that is not experienced, if you do not go through these rituals that tell you that you are in a different stage of life and these things, in the worst case, you go into schizophrenia. Because he talks about how does he say it? It's a biological necessity to have your life confirmed, to see in an external story what is going on in your life, how it is to be a human being. And that is, when you contrast it with schizophrenia, perhaps it's not so immoral to experience the joy of a tragedy. And but this is, you see this also in Ludwig Gies, one of the Kitsch critics, is talking about his point is that there's the idea of the Kitsch man, the way of misusing a painting or a drama or whatever. It's an attitude. And he talks about Augustine in the 4th century. And Augustine has seen a tragedy and he's so gripped by it and he's loving it so much, and afterwards the shame. He had forgotten God, and how could he feel this gluttony, this joy of seeing someone else suffer? And that's where the truth comes in and makes you unempathetic towards the actual necessity of a human being to be confirmed in that, like you've been talking about, that you get the confirmation that life is actually like this.
That's also another thing I've been thinking about as a possible explanation or definition of catharsis. I still find that fascinating, and I think Aristotle has some of the answers, and we have been into some of the answers, but it's still fascinating to think more about. And I think another aspect of catharsis, that enjoyment of feeling pity and terror, is to actually be confronted with the human destiny. Nietzsche talks about something similar in his Birth of Tragedy, using the image of looking down, having a glimpse into a deep, dark well. Just having this scary little glimpse into that dark, heavy human destiny. It's kind of a orientation towards reality in a very deep and sincere and direct and hurtful way, but which has the effect of not hiding from life. often been thinking that, for instance, death is one of these aspects that is a part of the human destiny. And I think it's so important that humans are in touch with one's own death, knowing that we are supposed to die. Not to be morbid in any sense, but just knowing that life is a journey towards death. And I have two comparisons that I use in my own mind. And the one is of one can say the typical modern man, unfortunately, because we have become very distant from our own death. They were actually just 100 years ago, they were more connected towards their death. Talking about it, taking pictures with a dead sibling to have a memory. Today we won't touch the dead. And the image I have of the typical modern man have almost never talked about death with someone. Thinks about it maybe very occasionally before sleeping or something, and then, oh, I need to take a sleeping pill or something. And on the deathbed gets that extreme anxiety and panic and screams in death anxiety. That must be horrible. I don't find a stronger word. And the other image I have is the Buddhist monk. He knows when he's about to die because he has used his whole life on meditation and contemplation. You don't have to be a Buddhist monk to contemplate. And upon the moment of death, he's laughing. Not in a ridiculing manner, but in a confirming manner. Because he knows he's been waiting for this his whole life.
Yeah.
And that can be one of the effects of catharsis, to actually have to be in touch with your own human destiny.
This has been pure joy. Carl Korsnes, thank you for coming to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you.